welcome everyone to this AMA series for the start of 2022. Our AMA series is on the notion of quality and the notion of failure by none other than Isabel Evans. About Isabel has more than 30 years of experience in the IT industry. Isabel is now a part-time postgraduate student at the University of Malta. And a lot of questions that we're going to ask today is based on her research that she's doing, focusing on human factors in test automation. So I'm looking forward to this interesting AMA and the learnings that we'll carry forward from this. Isabel is also known for a lot of keynotes and conference speaking assignments. She has chaired Eurostar 2019 and Steph 2018. She is also a recipient of the 2017 Eurostar Excellence Award. So welcome, Isabel. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased and happy to be here.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Just icebreaker before we get started, Isabel. Your 30 years of experience. So how did you start your software testing journey and where did the interest come into software testing?
Do you know, I think software testing chose me, really. Do you know, it's more than 30 years. It's getting on for 40 years. I suddenly realized the other day.
Wow.
Yes, exactly. I did a computer science degree in the 1970s. And as part of that, had programming jobs on placements. And then I had a breakout from the IT world. And when I came back into IT, I interviewed or applied for a programming role at a company. And because I'd been out of the industry for 4 years, they said, would I go first to the testing department and then they'd see how I got on and then re-interview me for a programming job later. Now, during my degree, we were expected to do testing. So when we handed in programming coursework, it was marked, part of the marking was what testing had we done. So I was used to the concept of testing. And in the jobs that I'd done, testing was very important. In fact, a lot of static testing was very important because you didn't get much access to a computer and you had one compile every 24 hours when you were writing your code, which could be unthinkable these days. So when I got this job and I went into the test team and I suddenly realized it was the testing I'd always enjoyed. I wasn't particularly interested in writing code. I was interested in solving problems and I was interested in testing whether those problems had been solved. So suddenly there I was in the right place. And it was a lovely start, that job, because it was focused on testing a particular package, and the designers and developers of that package had built the hooks for test automation into the software. So you used the software to run automated tests of the software itself. You used one version of the software to test another version of the software. And that was, I think, when I look back, I think that's still quite an extraordinary thing, that you didn't need an extra testing tool because they'd thought about testing so hard when they designed the product.
Great. Nice to know that. So a follow-up question to that, you have seen a lot of changes happening in the way people test. So has anything changed from when you started and what we see today in the world of software testing?
Some of it goes in cycles, I think. So I would say back in the 70s, you were seeing a lot of static testing, a lot of code review, and a lot of careful thought put into designing tests before you started running the program at all. And that was to do with the availability of environments on which to run the software. Coming through into the 80s, 90s, a lot of emphasis on, again, on pre-thought, on thinking in advance about what you wanted to test. In the 80s and 90s, certainly in the 80s, one of the things I was seeing was a need to move faster. And the companies I was working for then were looking at ways to move more quickly, but still improve quality. And so the idea of what's now become agile started to be being formed in people's minds. The idea that one might do more frequent deliveries and how you went about testing in smaller timescales. I think that in the 90s, it went back out to longer projects. And then obviously with Agile, it's come back down to smaller blocks of work. So I would say a lot of the challenges are the same. The challenges around pressure of time and pressure of budget. A lot of the stuff around complexity, I think the software domains are as complex as they've ever been. But the complexity in terms of having to deal with things that are online. So when I was first in IT, if you wanted to test, for example, the behavior of a system through financial year end, you had a standalone system, you could roll the date forward, you had control over it. But the more you interlink systems and the more you're sharing data between systems, the harder making that happen for testing in an easy way, the harder it becomes harder to do those things. So I think there's additional complexity with those sorts of areas, additional complexity in how systems are interlinked in a way they used not to be. And strangely, along with that, I think I'm seeing less emphasis, or for some years I was seeing less emphasis on test design techniques. I think those are resurging. I think they're coming back, that people are more interested now in things like, say, state transition testing, because they can understand that that's what they're looking at, is changing states. I would say there's additional challenges in terms of emphasis on ethical areas, on data. Artificial intelligence is an interesting one, because I think I was talking to Jason Arbon a couple of years ago about this, and I did some work on artificial intelligence back during my degree, and talking to him, I said to him, it doesn't feel like the algorithms have fundamentally changed. And he said to me, it's not the algorithms that have changed, and it's not the problems that have changed. What's changed is actually the processing power. So there are things that in theory we could look at doing in the past that now we can actually do. Well, that gives you a whole set of extra challenges for testing. So I don't know if I'm actually answering your question here. I'm just reflecting on how things have changed. So I would say I think testing is perhaps more complex than it used to be, perhaps more challenging.
Right. So there is one question from the attendees as well. It's more and like in today's world, with the inclusion of agile, our sprints have reduced to like 2 weeks, right? Mm-hmm. So the question here is more like, if I'm the only tester in the team, like how do I manage, how do I ensure quality when it is such a fast-paced world?
I'm going to reflect back to 1987, when I joined a company with around about 200 developers, and I was the first software tester they brought into the company. So the ratio there was me, one person to 200. And what could I do? And I could do a certain amount of testing. So one of the first things I did was demonstrate through the testing I was doing that I could add value to the developers and help them to make their software better. And having done that, I then embarked on a program of training them all to test not their own software, but each other's software, so that I made them more aware and able to test. And I think that's something that we can still do. We bring our knowledge of software testing and techniques and our knowledge of risk and of where bugs occur, and we show that to other people. And you can't do that until you've demonstrated that you're able to do testing that's of interest to people. But once you've done it, then you can engage everybody else in testing each other's software. That really helps. I think the other thing that helps, because it's a tremendous time saver, although it doesn't sometimes feel like that, is going right back to what I refer to as the static techniques, to sit down and have a half-hour discussion about the goals of what we're trying to do in this sprint, the risks associated with that, what's really important this time, what are the things we haven't thought of. And actually what you're doing there is you're testing to preempt bugs being built into the software in the first place. So the preventative work gets more and more important, I think, the faster you're moving, because you haven't got time to do the testing in the way that we would have done it when we had, say, 6 months for system testing. It's just not possible. So more and more preventative work, I would say.
Great. So there is one more question from Ganesh. He asks in terms of, how do we get people interested in adoption of new tools and how to keep them interested?
That's a really interesting question, because it's a really big question, actually, because the point here is, why would they be interested in tools? What's in it for them? Is it going to help them? Is the tool you're offering them going to help them solve their problem? And is it going to help them solve their problem in a way that they understand? So supposing we weren't software testers and software tools people, supposing we were in carpentry, and I've got a really good set of screwdrivers, and I just keep taking them around to people and saying, these are really good screwdrivers and you need some screwdrivers. But maybe that isn't what they need at the moment. Or maybe they don't understand what a screwdriver's for. It's kind of like, you've got to be thinking about it from their point of view. Just because you've got a tool that you can see as useful, it doesn't mean that anybody else is going to see the benefit of it. And this goes right actually into the heart of what I'm researching at the moment, because I think our attitude towards how we're doing testing at the moment is too tool-centric and not sufficiently people-centric. So I think we need to think about who is doing testing, what are their goals, what are the problems they're trying to solve, and therefore what tools do they need. And then when we take them tools, they're the tools that they need. So to use a different metaphor, it's a bit like, if you think of the tester as being like the surgeon in the operating theatre, and they're saying scalpel, drain, whatever else, they're not expecting somebody to come and say, well, I've got all these swabs. You do not want swabs at the moment? No, they want to be able to go scalpel, and somebody hands them the right scalpel. And I think if you're supplying tools, that's what you've got to be thinking of. You're serving the person who's doing the testing. I don't know if that's any help.
Yes, great one. So I'll just extend to that. So what do you think are the parameters, and based on a lot of research that you have done, that testers need to keep in mind while selecting a tool, and more importantly, convince the decision makers or in the market, who are purchasing these tools? So what sort of parameters do you think testers should keep in mind, and as well as decision makers?
Right. So the first thing is, again, what is your goal? What problem is it you're trying to solve? Why do you want the tool? Why do you think it's going to help you? Is there a different way of doing it? It's about understanding. It's about understanding your requirements. What is it you want? What is it you need? What are you trying to do? Who's going to be using the tool? What are their attributes? For example, a few years ago, I worked in a company which was building assistive software, and a lot of my colleagues in the test department were registered blind. And we were given a directive by management to bring in test automation and also tools to support agile working methods. And I was going around expos at conferences and asking, does your tool work with assistive software? Can somebody use it with a screen reader? Say, I don't know. But actually, I'd got that group of people who needed that. And the tools could have been as good as they wanted, but they didn't meet those people's needs. There's no point getting anything that couldn't be read, it couldn't be used with a screen reader or magnifier and so on and so forth. So actually understanding the requirements, understanding the people who are going to use the tool, understanding what tasks they're going to do, understanding the way they think and the way they want to carry their tasks out. That's what you need to think of initially, first of all. And then if you go back and look, well, goodness, if you look at Dorothy Graham and Mark Fuster's work on tool acquisition in the books they were writing decades ago, make a short list, look to see what different tools do, pilot some of them. If you're running a pilot or a proof of concept, don't expect that that's necessarily going to lead to you adopting that tool. And then something coming out from the research, which is really important, I think. When I did the first lot of the research and I was asking people for their experiences with tools, the tools, in terms of their quality attributes, a lot of problems coming up around security, around performance, around compatibility with other tools, around compatibility with different platforms, around maintainability. So actually, things change over time. Whether this is a test management tool or a test execution tool, over time, how you use it is going to change. Does it support that? And one of the key findings, which I published a complete paper about, was some of the vendors' tools looked like they had thought about usability really hard. They had very nice interfaces, but actually, those were some of the most frustrating tools because although superficially they look nice, in practice, sustained use, they didn't support. So don't be beguiled by something that looks pretty. Go and see if it's actually going to support your workflow, not the tool's workflow, but how you want to do your work. Has it been written with your type of software domain in mind? Has it been written for the skill sets of the people that you've got in your organization? I had some people reporting back in the experience research that they had tools which were insufficiently flexible and they were more technical and they wanted more flexibility. And we had other people reporting back, no, these tools are too hard to use. I need something that's more abstracted where I've got an easier interface. So actually, this it's key, isn't it? This is about people and what the people are doing. So that's the first thing. And it should be the same actually with any bit of software we acquire. We think about who's using it and their goals and problems first.
Great, really great answer. So just extending on that question as well, right? So based on your research, in terms of what are the user experiences observed, while using test automation tools, and where do you see they actually lag and where we can improve in this area?
This is partly part of the ongoing research. So what I'm looking at next in the research is about what's the UX framework for test tools. So I don't have the answers to that, but what I do have is the evidence of UX problems from the data I've collected so far. And what was quite shocking to me and surprising was this is not just a user experience thing. It's not just the tester's experience in terms of directly them and the tools, but the knock-on effect that it was having into people's work lives and their lives in general. So in sense of people's health and welfare, their motivation, there was very, very high levels of emotion being shown. And this was particularly in two areas: the one-to-one interviews, where it was a private conversation, and in the anonymous surveys. And what was interesting was I ran a number of workshops in open forum at conferences, and people were coming up to me and saying, I wanted to say this and this and this, but I couldn't with everybody else there. So there's an underlying stream of people who are frightened to say that this tool is not right, or I don't understand what I'm doing. And people were talking about their fear and their frustration and their upset, and that they felt stuck. Even to the point of people saying that they felt they were being treated as a mechanism, that they were no longer being treated as a person. So that's really what's impelled me on to the second half of the research, to look at how can we make tool design more people-centric, and actually really think about what the effect is on people's jobs and their lives of using test tools.
Great. So we'll come to talking a lot more about tools. I also want to understand the notion of failure, since we are also going to talk about that. So what is the importance of the notion of failure? What's your thoughts around this?
I came up with this a few years ago because I've been asked to do a series of work of talks about quality, and one of them in particular, I was asked to do a talk called "The Notion of Quality." And of course, the first thing you do is say, well, we need to define quality, and it's really hard to define. And as I was thinking about it, I realized it's very easy when you see the opposite of quality, when you see failure, to say, oh, this is not good enough. But it's really hard to define what quality is. And there's so many different definitions of it by thinkers inside the software industry and outside the software industry, and so many different ways, and the concept's expressed, from it being an idea of excellence, through it being an idea of meeting a specification, through it being to do with customer satisfaction. And for defining quality, I prefer to look at the definition. Oh, this is one of these, I'm having a senior moment. My mind's just gone a blank. It'll come back to me later in the webinar at an inconvenient moment. But there's a 5-step definition of quality, which talks about it from the point of view of, there's a manufacturing view of quality, where you say, did it meet the specification? Did we use the right processes? Did we test it properly? How many bugs did we find? And of course, some of the problems with that is if we have the wrong specification, it's not going to work. It's also very technical. And then there's a product view of it, which is about performance, security, and those other attributes. There's a value view, which says, could we afford it? So if you do too much engineering, you might have something that's technically manufacturing really excellent, but if the customer can't afford it, it's not quality for them. We have a user view, which is about whether an individual can carry their own task out, and that's different for every single user. So different users might have a different perception of the quality of a product. And then we have the transcendent view, which is about how we feel about the company that's providing the software or the product, and how we feel about the people we're interacting with. So it's like the overall experience. And when you have a failure, what's interesting is you might have a failure that's a manufacturing failure. So perhaps there's a bug, but whether that impacts on quality depends on whether you're taking a user view or a product view or a manufacturing view, for example. But if you have a bug, a manufacturing problem that knocks on into the user or the transcendent or the value view, that's where people see a failure, and that's where it's very damaging. So when you get things like the BA problem a few years ago, where there was a power surge and the backup system didn't work, and there's a knock-on effect, and people can't get their luggage and they can't get on and off the aeroplanes, and thousands of people are affected. One little thing, one little power failure, and then the knock-on effects into the failure, it becomes absolutely huge. So they might have done loads of testing on that system and seen that done a calculation saying, well, that's not very likely to happen. It's a low risk. The impact isn't high because the backup system will come in. And then when the backup system doesn't come in, has anybody tested through what the impact was of that? If you went to somebody and said, we need to test that whole stream, they might say to you, don't be ridiculous because the risk's so low. But actually, when it fails, worldwide coverage, huge impact. So I think if we understand failure, We can understand why we might want to do certain tests, why it might be worth doing some sort of failover testing, why we might want to pick out risks that don't look so high and run them through and look at consequences. I think earlier question you had was about how has testing changed? And I think one of the ways it's changed is if you go back 30 years, you could get away with saying, I'm just testing this software on this system. But actually, almost any software you look at now, there are so many interactions across the internet and across different organizations, different systems, and so on. You have to be thinking big. You can't be thinking, I'm a software tester, this is my responsibility. You have to be thinking, what if, and what if, and what if? That's one of the reasons it's a really exciting job to do. You know, dismiss anybody who tells you testing's boring, because if you're really into it, you're into everything. You're across everything, you know. It's all up for grabs. And all the time you're investigating what could possibly happen. Yeah, so I think that's why failure is interesting. Quality is so difficult to define and so dependent on the viewpoint of the person who's talking about it. But failure we can all look at and go, yeah, that shouldn't have happened.
Great points there, Isabel. I think failure is the stepping stone to being successful. So that's great. So there's one more question, and we have been hearing about it a long time as well, about test craftsmanship. So Manjunath asked this question: test craftsmanship versus test automation, the significance and importance of both now and in the future.
So the craft of testing. You know, there's been a book, there was a book, The Art of Testing, there was a book, The Craft of Testing. People talk about the science of testing. This is where the testing's happening, okay? The tools are not going to do the testing for you. And I know there's a lot of tools now with AI and with, you know, functionality of all sorts and so on and so forth. Behind each of those, there's a human brain. And this, you know, that's what's important, is the craft of testing. It's about how we as people use those tools, what we tell the tools to do. Even in a tool with artificial intelligence in it, you know, that's now, right now, today, and I would say, I'm going to be cynical here, but as far as I can see into the future, that's not intelligence in the way this is intelligence. There's something different going on there. And even more if you've got 2 people or 3 people working together, multiple brains exchanging ideas. You know, that's where it is. That's where the craft is important, where actually it's us as testers. And I'm going to give you an example actually from research. Now, I'm learning to research at the moment. And as part of that, I'm having to learn how to use certain research tools. And there's a particular one I'm using, which is for a form of data analysis called qualitative analysis. And the people who build and sell that tool make a very strong point that it's not doing your research for you. You, the researcher, are doing the research. You are thinking about the data. You are deciding how you're going to group the data, what the data means, what meanings you're going to assign to different pieces of information you're getting. It's very, very easy to get survey data from a survey like the one I'm running at the moment into that tool, and the tool will import it and it'll divide it up into different documents. And if you put special coding messages on the top of columns in the spreadsheet, it'll assign things to different document groups and all the rest of it. But it's not doing the research, because if you get that bit wrong, or if you don't understand what you're doing, you end up with the tool full of data, but you don't know what it means. You can't, and the tool's not coming back and saying, oh, you've given me this data and I've just worked out this is what testers are saying about their tools. No, only you can do that as a human being. And it's the same with testing. The tools are not doing the testing. You're doing the testing. That's what's really important.
Great point there, Isabel. So just extending to this one, you have almost been here now in the testing space for quite some long time, and tools have been evolving, right? You have seen the earlier days of the likes of QTP and then Windrunners, and then slowly evolving to open source, and now integration with AI and ML. So yeah, are we going in the right direction with regards to the evolution, and what do you think based on your experience and the research?
I don't know. I don't know, honestly, because I don't know that I don't think I don't, well, okay, for me personally, what I've realized out of the research is I don't really have a strong grip on who is who is testing software. And that's why I'm researching that at the moment, who is actually doing this. And if I don't feel like I've got a grip on it with my level of experience and how much I've been around the industry and into different organizations, then does anybody? Well, they may well, I'm not a hugely clever person, I plod along and I do things and I think about things, but I'm not the cleverest person in the world. I'm not the most knowledgeable person in the world. But I just feel like as human beings, we're so prone to missteps, aren't we? We're so prone to thinking that this is the next best thing and it's going to really help us. And it's not always the case. So it's possible that we've found some things recently that are in the right direction, but it's also possible that we haven't. And it's kind of like, it's only retrospectively really that you can tell. So no, I'm sorry, that's a really woolly and useless answer. But I tell you something, nearly 40 years in the industry, I have more questions than I have answers. I really do.
That's great. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about your publication on achieving software quality to teamwork. Would you like to throw some light? Is quality everyone's responsibility, and how can we achieve software quality to teamwork?
Okay. When I wrote that book, I had worked in several organizations as a tester and then several organizations as a quality manager, looking wide across organizational processes. And it was just becoming more and more obvious to me, first of all, that we expect people to work in teams, but they aren't always very comfortable working in teams and aren't always very good at communicating. And secondly, that communication seemed to be key to achieving quality. And I started tabulating it, and I realized that every single person, every single role, if you like, around a software project had information that everybody else needed, and they didn't realize it. And also wanted information from other people, but didn't know how to ask for it. So in that book, I was trying to say, look, if you're in this role, you have to talk to these other people, and you're getting information from them, and you're giving them information that you're taking for granted, and you don't realize they don't know this thing. And the same thing's true the other way around. And I started thinking about some of the processes that we use in projects, like planning and estimating, and like document reviews and meetings, and thinking, how do we use those? And is there a way we could do that where actually all the time we're saying, what are the failure points? What's important about quality? What do we need to communicate with each other? So what I tried to do was assemble ways to help people think about different sorts of problems and examples of how those might be used and how I'd seen things being used in different ways. So that was one of the streams. The other stream through it was I realized that quite often in software projects, we're very focused on delivering the software into live, but actually there's some time before a project starts and after the software is delivered. And so actually you have a 4-stage life history for any piece of software, which is the idea being developed, and then the project to actually build it, and the deployment, and then post-deployment it being used, and then actually it's retired at some point. And each of those need to be managed. And the definition of quality changes through that life cycle of that product. And what's acceptable to do changes. So whereas when you're designing the product and building it, this project is quite short and the lifespan of the software is quite long and it's going to be maintained and changed. You have to build maintainability in. Whereas if you're an end-of-life product, maintainability is not so important. What's important is maybe data cleaning and data transfer. So it's kind of like it was trying to play with some of those ideas about how, as a team, we need to communicate, or we'll never understand quality and we'll never understand each other, and how that changes over the life cycle, the lifespan of a piece of software.
Great, really good one. So again, as you're talking about a lot about your research on tools, so one thing wanted to ask you, like, how intense should be the learning curves when you're dealing with tools? Now, if you've seen the evolution of tools which are coming up, which, lessen the learning curve gap. So have you seen the kind of frustration in your research or that or some suggestions coming out of your research where there has been a frustration in terms of high adoption in learning a particular tool?
Yes, and it varies because I think you get some. Right. So the analogy I've been using around this is it's like learning to play a piano. So if you have a pianola where you put a roll in and it's all automated and it plays itself, there's a very short learning curve. It's about how you load the roll in to play the tune. And you don't develop in any way whatsoever. So you don't actually learn how to play the piano. And that can be very frustrating for people because there's only one thing they can do with the tool and it does that thing, but they can't change it or develop themselves. And so there's a short learning curve and then frustration because there's a limit to what you can do. And then on the other hand, if you give somebody a concert grand and it's in the Carnegie Hall and you say to them, go and play that concert grand, it's too hard to do. And it takes years to get to the point where you're able to play in the Carnegie Hall. Now, most of us, if we wanted to play the piano, would be somewhere between those two. And we might just want to have a little keyboard and we play a few tunes and maybe it's a backing track and, it's easy to do. Or we might want to develop on over time. So different people have different trajectories at different points where they might give up or get frustrated. So it's not a simple, easy, this works for everybody kind of answer. And I think with the software tools, with the testing tools, what I've seen is a similar thing. So some people were reporting experiences with tools where there was no flexibility and they couldn't, as they were developing knowledge, the tool wasn't taking them along. It was holding them back. And then other tools where people were not given enough, frustrated because they weren't given enough time to learn it. And so one report I had was somebody who was saying, and this was particularly weird, the developers were given 6 months to learn how to work with this particular framework. And then when the testers were brought on board, they were given 3 weeks and they weren't as technical. And it was actually one of the developers I was talking to about this, just saying it was completely crazy. I mean, they just all gave up because it was like being taken into the Carnegie Hall and the learning curve was too high. So what organizations need to do is understand how much time are they prepared to allow for learning. And some of that's initial. And then some of it is as you're using the tool, growing and developing and finding new ways of using it. So if you've got a tool if you've got a scripting tool, you'll be able to learn to use some. It's ideal to be able to learn to use it for some easy scripts quite quickly, but you'd expect to be supported over time to develop that skill. And the same with other types of tool as well. So I think, yes, certainly frustrations both with long learning curves and with short. And somebody did make a comment that some of the tools where there's a long learning curve, if you have the support to put that effort in, the payback is much greater. So there's also, there's a mix there of what people's expectations are. It's not a simple one size fits all.
Absolutely. Learning curve is really important. And yeah, we would want to save a crunch time there. So we're talking about testing, and testing is really, really vast. Based on all the outputs that you've got from your research, like where are testers using tools and power of tools at various stages of testing? Would you like to throw some light on them?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think James Bark has spoken or written about this recently, saying that people aren't using tools across all the testing activities in a way that they might do. And I think there's something in that. If you look at academic research about testing tools, it's quite often focused on test design. So implementing tools to aid the way we design tests, and a focus as well on automating test execution. And if you look in the industry, people talk about test tools, and they're very often, when they're talking about automation and tools, they're talking about test execution. But in fact, we need tool support for all the test management tasks, whether it's providing estimates, putting plans together, doing risk assessment, whether it's reporting on results and residual risk, all of those test management sort of activities, we need tools to help us. Tools could potentially help us. Certainly test design and test strategies, capturing the results of testing to look at later. Obviously things like fault management. And I think a lot of those are ones where, to me, you might need multiple interfaces. So if you're, say, reporting on the results of testing, a test management activity, you might want one interface for senior managers to look at, which is mainly about budget and residual risk and potential costs and things like that. And another which is perhaps for the development group, which is about what's gone well. I think it's really important when we talk to the development group that we actually tell them what they've done well. We spend too much time reporting faults to them, not enough telling them that they've done a good job, which they usually have. And you might have another one for the testers themselves, which is the details of what tests have been run and what haven't, and perhaps code coverage and requirements coverage and that sort of thing. And where we're not clever, I think, sometimes with tool use in real projects, so I'm talking here about sorts of things I've seen, is we don't use tools in a way that tailors to what individual recipients of the information need. And I think testing is very much about sharing information. So if we think of the tool set as being actually a way of collecting, analyzing and disseminating information, as opposed to something that's to do with speeding things up or saving money, then we might get further with building a tool set that's actually useful for people.
Great one. So yeah, we're coming towards the end of the AMA, so I'll have to ask a few specific ones which I definitely wanted to ask you. One is on, are there any 3 major takeaways or highlights from your research which you would like to let the audience know here about?
Okay. So the first one is we, the industry, organizations, the testing community, teams, whoever, we're not thinking enough about people's lived experience. We're not thinking enough about motivation and the level of emotion and stress that people can be under. And somebody earlier talked about working in tight timescales. Agile, I think, is probably more stressful for people than many people would like to admit. There's nowhere to rest, So we need to think about people's work rhythms. We need to think about the effect of both process tooling and organizational team decisions, team shape decisions on people's lives, because it's affecting people right back to their health. So that's the first big takeaway. The second big takeaway is usability is important for our tools that we're using ourselves, but it's not the only thing that's important. And it's easy to do it really badly and superficially. So when you're selecting tools, when you're considering tools, think very hard about your actual requirements and needs and whether the tool is actually going to meet those, how much it's going to allow you to solve your problems in your way, and how much it's conversely going to drive your workflow. Think about how that tool is going to work with the rest of the tools you've got in your tool set. Think of it as a software acquisition.
Great. One more thing, and we have many of the people here as well who are going to start their journey into testing and test automation. So any advice for someone starting into testing, test automation, dealing with tools, and what mistakes they should not commit?
Okay.
Any thoughts there?
First thing is welcome, and you're going to have a great time. It's a wonderful area to work in. I'm still enjoying it. It's still good fun all these years later. Secondly, there's a lot of career paths through testing, within testing itself, and branching out into other areas. Thirdly, your critical skill sets are around your ability to learn and your ability to think critically and your ability to ask questions. So always be thinking about that. It's lifelong learning. And I would say as well, get your head around the basics. Things like test design techniques. Now, I know those and I've taught them and written about them. But still, if I come onto a new testing project, it's like playing a musical instrument. You need to practice with them. So if I haven't used them for a bit, I know I need to practice. Think of those skills as like a musical instrument that you've got to keep practicing.
Yes, practice is definitely the key for sure. There's one more question in terms of if Isabel Evans was given a chance to build or conceptualize a testing tool for the future, what would it be, and what is your vision on it?
I don't know yet, but ask me back in a couple of years and I should have built the framework that I'm struggling towards. Do you know what? I'm not predicting it, because if you'd asked me 5 years ago, before I started the research, I'd have come up with an answer. But the more I do the research, the more I realize this has got to be driven by the data I get from people in the industry. Like, it doesn't matter what I think and what I want, because it might not be what everybody else needs. So, it'll come out of the data. Please fill the survey in.
Definitely. So yes, people, there is a link to the survey link. I think your inputs would definitely help better the user experience of testing tools. So get there for sure. So there are a few questions. I'm trying to club them together in terms of the tools that you have. Like, where do you see tools heading in the future, right? In terms of your experiences of working with tools when you initially started, and where they're heading. And
do do you know what? I said to you that that place that I'd worked where the tool was built in with the software under test,
Mm-hmm.
that was so good. It was so nice to use. It was so easy in a lot of ways and so efficient that I wish people would build more software where they built the testing tool into the software. Um, it just was a joy. So almost like I wish people would revert back to that. Um, that I think is what I want to say on that one. Yeah.
Awesome. So I'll take a few icebreaker ones, which are not much into the test automation space, but definitely you have been attending a lot of conferences and you have been an event chair also at a lot of conferences and virtual events happening. And, in the times of the pandemic as well, we see a lot of events happening. So, what is your advice to people attending conferences? What should they look towards with the conferences or with such kind of AMAs and webinars?
Yeah.
Any advice there?
If it's a big conference, don't try and do everything. It's exhausting. You need to plan your time out and decide on a few things and give yourself breaks to go and do some of the social stuff and things like the test labs and going around the expo and chatting with people. Um, I'm obviously talking now more with in-person conferences, which is obviously over my career is what I've been used to. But I made friends at some of the first conferences I went to as a fairly young tester who are still friends in the industry. And I think that opportunity to discuss with your peer group is almost more important than the talks you go to. So definitely do that. And I would say, for me personally, the online is even more exhausting than the in person. So make sure you take a break. Make sure you look away from the screen occasionally if it's an online one. But again, still try and keep the sort of social thing going as well as the learning. And by the way, think about when the time's right for you had to bring your stories to the conference, because the conferences are really made in a lot of ways by the younger speakers who are coming in, or the less experienced speakers who are coming in saying, I was on this project, this thing happened, this is what we did about it. Much more than those of us who've been around a long time. We have different stories to tell maybe. So if you want to speak at a conference, start applying to speak at conferences.
Definitely, that was going to be my next question, where I was
I'm
going
sorry.
to ask you with regards to what should aspiring speakers, because you have been a keynote speaker at a lot of conferences, and any particular advice for budding speakers to come into this space and
Yes,
share their
start
stories.
applying. Do you know what? I didn't realise that you applied to speak at conferences, and it wasn't till Dot Graham, who's been a great mentor to me all my career, it wasn't until she said to me, why aren't you speaking at conferences? And I said, well, nobody's invited me. And she kind of rolled her eyes and said, no, you don't understand. You have to put yourself forward. And I think, that is actually, and that's a general piece of career advice, actually. I didn't realize, I thought, you do good work and people notice you. But actually, you have to tell people you've done the good work, because otherwise they don't notice. So getting over one's shyness, I think, is important in all these things. And the other thing about speaking at conferences is you're going to have to speak at meetings. And in a funny way, speaking at a conference is almost easier because you don't know those people. And it'll make you more confident for going back and speaking in meetings at work.
Thank you so much for that. So yes, we are on the top of the hour now. So Isabel, one important question: any quick advice to the testing community and for everyone here who's attending?
Yes, communicate, listen to each other, listen to your different points of view and be accepting of those different points of view, and express your own point of view logically, politely, kindly. So communicating, listening and speaking, and keep that communication going. Keep discussing things, because all through my career, it's been through discussing things that we've made progress as a community. And that community sense and that communication, so important.
Thank you so much. And I think a great way to end it, it's about communicating and being part of the community. So thank you so much, Isabel. It was an honor. I'm sure all of the audiences enjoyed this conversation. And thank you for accepting the invite and sharing a few thoughts about your research. I'm sure that has been got years and years into this, and sharing it in 1 hour completely may not be possible, but yes, I think there was a lot to learn from all of this, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for asking such brilliant questions. I was so scared beforehand that this was, am I going to be able to do this? But, great questions, and I've really enjoyed myself. Thank you so much.